My birth mother didn't want a relationship. She wanted my bone marrow. I need you to sit with that for a second before I keep going, because when I first read those words in a letter from a stranger's attorney, sitting at my kitchen table in Phoenix, Arizona on a Wednesday morning, with my second cup of coffee still steaming beside me, I read the sentence 4 times, and each time my brain just quietly refused to process it. Not because I didn't understand the words individually. I understood every single one. It was the combination that my mind kept sliding off of, like trying to grip something wet and smooth. My name is Hazel Brennan. I'm 24 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant at a firm called Caldwell & Marsh here in Phoenix. I find things that people try to hide inside numbers. Discrepancies, patterns, missing amounts, fabricated entries. I am professionally trained to spot when something doesn't add up, and to follow that thread quietly and carefully until the whole picture reveals itself. I tell you that because it matters. It matters for how I handled what came next, and it matters for why I didn't just fall apart the way maybe another person would have. I was adopted when I was 3 weeks old. My parents are Gerald and Lynn Brennan, and they are the most real, most whole, most genuinely present people I have ever known in my life. My dad coached high school football for 27 years and has a handshake that makes grown men wince. My mom is the kind of woman who shows up before you even call her, who somehow always knows, who has fed every sad or lost or broken person who has ever walked through her front door. I have 2 older brothers, Callum and Dean, both biological to my parents, both ridiculous, both the kind of brothers who would drive 4 hours in the middle of the night if I needed them, and complain about it the entire way there and never let me forget it and mean every word of it with their whole chest. I knew I was adopted. Always. It was never a hidden thing, never a painful thing, just a quiet fact that lived in the corner of my life and never demanded anything from me. I never searched. Never felt the pull. My husband Marco used to ask me sometimes, gently, if I was ever curious, and I would think about it honestly for a moment and then say no, and mean it. I had everything. Why would I go looking for more, when what I already had was more than most people get in a lifetime? If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because this one is going to take every bit of you before it's done. So, the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday. No return address on the envelope, but a formal attorney's letterhead inside, crisp and deliberate, from a man named R. Clement Sharp, practicing family and civil law out of Tucson. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first explained who he was and that he represented a private client. The second said his client had spent approximately 22 months locating me through legal channels. The third said his client wished to make contact regarding a matter described as urgent, deeply personal, and carrying direct implications for my physical well-being. And the fourth paragraph. The fourth paragraph said his client had been diagnosed 18 months ago with a rare bone marrow condition, that she had exhausted matching options through standard registries, that her medical team had identified a biological first-degree relative as her highest probability match, that she was asking, formally, through legal representation, which should tell you everything about how she expected this to go, whether I would be willing to undergo compatibility testing. She wasn't looking for me. She was looking for a match. I put the letter flat on the table and pressed both palms against it like I needed to hold it down. My coffee was still steaming. The morning was still completely ordinary outside my kitchen window. A neighbor's sprinkler was running. A dog was barking 2 houses down, and I was sitting there in my work clothes, reading a letter from the mother who gave me away, asking me to save her life. I didn't call Marco. Not yet. I have this thing where I need to hold information alone first, turn it around in my own hands before anyone else touches it. Marco calls it my soft delay. My therapist calls it a self-regulation strategy. I call it the only way I know how to think clearly. I read the letter a 5th time, and somewhere underneath the shock, underneath the surreal quality of the whole moment, a question started forming, quiet and specific, the way questions form in me when something in the numbers doesn't balance. She spent 22 months finding me. She had a diagnosis 18 months ago, which meant she started looking for me 4 months before the diagnosis. I sat very still with that. Why was she looking for me before she was sick? I called in late to work that morning. First time in 2 years. I told my supervisor I had a family matter, which was technically true in the most disorienting way possible. Then I sat at that kitchen table for another hour with the letter and my cold coffee and the sound of the neighborhood going about its completely normal Wednesday. And I started doing what I do. I started pulling the thread. The math didn't work. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Not emotionally, not morally, mathematically. The timeline in that letter had a gap in it, and the gap was 4 months wide, and no one had explained it or even acknowledged it. Attorney Sharp had written the letter carefully, selectively, in the way that people write things when they want to give you just enough to get what they need from you, without giving you enough to ask the right questions. I know that style of communication well. I see it in financial documents all the time. I went to my laptop and searched R. Clement Sharp, Tucson, Arizona. He was real. Licensed since 2003. Family law and civil litigation. Clean record with the state bar. Small firm. 3 attorneys total. Nothing alarming. I searched the firm name. Nothing alarming there either. I noted his direct line from the letterhead, and wrote it on a separate piece of paper, because I needed to think before I called. Then I did something I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I searched the bone marrow condition she'd referenced. Aplastic anemia, the letter had called it. I read about it for 40 minutes. Survival rates, treatment options, transplant procedures, donor compatibility, first-degree biological relatives, parents, siblings, children, represent the highest likelihood of a successful match. The search process through national registries can take months or years, with no guarantee. Everything in the letter checked out medically. That wasn't where the inconsistency lived. The inconsistency lived in those 4 months. Marco came home for lunch. He works close enough to do that on days he remembers to, and he found me still at the kitchen table with the letter and 3 pages of handwritten notes. He's used to me working through things this way. He sat down across from me without saying anything and waited. That's one of the things I love most about him. He knows when to wait. I slid the letter across the table. I watched his face as he read it. He's expressive, Marco, in the way that quiet people sometimes are. Everything shows around his eyes, even when his mouth stays still. I saw confusion, then a kind of careful stillness, then something I recognized as protectiveness. He put the letter down. Hazel, I know. Are you okay? I don't know yet. He reached across and covered my hand with his. What do you want to do? And that was the question. That was the only question that mattered, and also the one I had absolutely no answer to, sitting there in the middle of that ordinary Wednesday. What I didn't tell Marco yet, because I was still turning it over, was the 4-month gap. I wanted to understand it myself first. I wanted to know what it meant before I put it in someone else's hands, even his. That afternoon, I called Attorney Sharp. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting my call. People who are surprised pick up differently. There's a beat of reorientation. He had none of that. Just a smooth, professional hello, and then my name, like he already knew. Ms. Brennan, thank you for reaching out. I told him I had received his letter, and I had questions before I was willing to consider anything. He said, of course, completely understandable. He was happy to answer what he could. I noted the qualifier. What he could. I asked him to clarify the timeline. I kept my voice even and professional, the same voice I use when I'm interviewing a CFO whose expense reports have started looking creative. I told him the letter indicated his client had begun the search process approximately 22 months ago, but had received her diagnosis 18 months ago, and I wanted to understand the discrepancy. There was a pause. Not a long pause. Maybe 2 seconds. But I've been doing this long enough to know that a 2-second pause from an attorney who has been smooth up until that moment is not nothing. My client had some preliminary health concerns she was monitoring prior to the formal diagnosis, he said. The search was initiated somewhat in advance as a precautionary measure. Precautionary. She started a 22-month legal search for a child she gave away 24 years ago as a precautionary measure. I wrote that word down on my notepad and underlined it. I see, I said. And can you tell me whether your client, has any other biological children? Another pause. Shorter this time. I'm not able to share details about my client's personal life beyond what's relevant to her request, which was not a no. I thanked him, told him I needed time to consider, and ended the call. I sat with my notepad. The word precautionary sat there, underlined, and underneath the medical facts, and the legal language, and the surreal quality of the whole situation, something was quietly assembling itself in the back of my mind, a shape I couldn't see fully yet, but could feel the edges of. She had other options she hadn't exhausted. I was certain of it. Not medically. Medically, I believed the letter. But personally, there were things Attorney Sharp was not saying, and the spaces where he wasn't saying them were starting to form a pattern. I called my oldest brother Callum that evening. Didn't tell him why, just asked him how he was. Listened to him talk about his kids for 20 minutes, and felt the specific comfort of something completely uncomplicated. Then I hung up and stared at the ceiling, and thought about a woman I had never met who had spent 22 months, and what I imagined was a significant amount of money tracking me down through legal channels. And I thought, people don't do that just because they're sick. People do that because they need something specific. Something they can only get from you. I didn't sleep well for the next 4 days, and I'm not someone who loses sleep easily. Marco noticed. He always notices, but he gives me room, which is one of the reasons I married him. He left coffee ready every morning without commenting on the fact that I'd been lying awake beside him with my eyes open. He texted me small things during the day. A photo of a dog he saw outside a gas station. A voice memo of a song he thought I'd like. He was holding space for me the way he does. And I was grateful and also too deep inside my own head to tell him that properly. On the 5th day, I called Attorney Sharp again. I had spent those 4 days doing what I do best. Building a picture from fragments. I had searched public records, court filings, property records, business registrations, all publicly available, nothing invasive. For any woman in Tucson whose last name might connect to mine through adoption records, cross-referenced with approximate age ranges, I found 4 possible candidates. Then I narrowed by medical facility affiliations, listed in charitable donation records, for a hospital foundation in Tucson that specialized in hematological conditions, down to 2. One of them had a LinkedIn profile, with a profile photo. I stared at that photo for a long time. She had my nose. Not vaguely, not if you squint. She had my nose exactly. The slight asymmetry at the bridge, the specific way it turns just barely at the tip. I have always been self-conscious about that nose. Marco calls it distinguished. My mom always said it gave my face character. Apparently it came from somewhere. Her name was Renata Solis. 51 years old. She had worked for 20 years as an office manager at a commercial real estate firm in Tucson. Her LinkedIn hadn't been updated in 2 years, which fit the timeline of a serious illness. I found a brief mention of her in a local Tucson business publication from 8 years ago, a profile piece on women in commercial real estate. The article mentioned she was a Tucson native, that she had one adult son named Bryce, and that she was, quote, deeply committed to her family. One adult son, not one child. One son. So she did have another biological child. Which meant I was not her only option for a familial match. Which meant Bryce had either already been tested and wasn't a match, or, and this was the part that sat uncomfortably in my chest, he hadn't been asked. Why come for me before exhausting the child she actually raised? I called Attorney Sharp and I asked him directly. I told him I had some information I'd gathered independently, and I wanted to ask a specific question. He paused, that same careful pause, and said he would answer what he was able to. I asked if his client had a biological son named Bryce, and whether that individual had been considered as a potential donor match. The silence this time was longer. 4 seconds. 5. Miss Brennan, he said finally, I'm not in a position to discuss my client's other family relationships. That's not what I asked, I said. I asked whether he had been considered as a match. My client's medical team has identified you as the preferred compatibility candidate based on available information. Preferred. Not only preferred. I thanked him and hung up. I sat with that word the same way I'd sat with precautionary. These words were doing a lot of work in this situation. They were load-bearing words, holding up something heavy that nobody was naming directly. That night, I told Marco everything. The full picture. The timeline, Bryce, the preferred language, all of it. I watched him listen. He's an engineer, Marco, and he processes information the way I do. Quietly. Completely. Without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. So she has a son, he said. Yes. And she came to you instead. Yes. Why? That's what I need to find out. He nodded slowly. Then he said something that cracked the whole thing open a little further. Hazel, what if Bryce doesn't know about you? I hadn't let myself go there yet. Not fully. I had circled the edge of it but hadn't stepped in. What if she came to me? The daughter she gave away. The one with no relationship, no history, no claim on her. Specifically because asking me kept the secret intact. What if I was the safer ask, the cleaner ask, the ask that didn't require her to have a conversation she'd been avoiding for 24 years? What if she wasn't coming to me because I was her best option medically? What if she was coming to me because I was her most convenient secret? I sat with that for the rest of the night. The next morning, I did one more search. I looked for Bryce Solis in Tucson, found him easily. 31 years old, worked in construction management, married, 2 kids, coached youth soccer on weekends based on a community league website listing. He had a whole life. A complete life. And somewhere inside that life, there was a piece of information his mother had been carrying alone for at least 24 years. I thought about what it would mean for him to find out. I thought about what it would mean for her if he found out she'd gone around him. I thought about what it would mean for me to walk into this situation and what I would be walking out of it with, on the other side, regardless of what I decided. The medical question and the ethical question had completely separated in my mind by now. They were 2 different decisions wearing the same coat, and I needed to look at them individually. I made an appointment with my own doctor to understand what compatibility testing actually involved physically. I wanted facts, not feelings, before I let feelings have the floor. And I didn't send, just drafted, a letter to Attorney Sharp. 3 sentences. Asking for a meeting. Not a phone call. A meeting. In person. With his client present. If she wanted something from me that significant, she was going to have to sit across from me and ask for it herself. I sent the letter on a Monday morning and had a response by Tuesday afternoon. Attorney Sharp called me directly this time rather than writing back, which told me the meeting request had shifted something. There was a different quality to his voice. Still professional, still careful, but with a layer of something underneath it that I recognized after years of interviews and depositions. He was managing a client who was nervous. You can hear that in a lawyer's voice when you know what to listen for. A slight overprecision in the phrasing, a half-second longer on the pauses. He said his client had agreed to meet. He proposed a neutral location, a private conference room at his firm in Tucson. I said I would come the following Saturday. He asked if I would be bringing anyone with me. I said yes, my husband. Marco came without a single question about whether he should. I told my parents the night before we drove to Tucson. I sat on the phone with my mom for 40 minutes. I'd been dreading that call for 2 weeks. Had run different versions of it in my head. Worried she'd be hurt. Worried she'd feel threatened. Worried something fragile would shift between us that couldn't shift back. Instead, she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which, for my mom, is an act of pure disciplined love, and then she said, Hazel baby, you are our daughter that doesn't have an off switch. Go find out what this woman needs, and you decide, you, nobody else, what you're willing to do about it. I cried after I hung up. Just for a few minutes. Then I packed my bag for Tucson. The conference room was small and neutral, the way those rooms always are. A table, chairs, a water pitcher, a window with the blinds half open. Attorney Sharp was already there when Marco and I arrived, standing near the window, and beside him was a woman who stood up when we walked in. Renata Solis was smaller than I expected. I don't know what I expected exactly. She was slight, with dark hair cut short in the way that sometimes follows a long illness, and she was dressed carefully, precisely, in the way that people dress when they want to look more capable than they feel. She had the same nose as me. Up close, it was almost startling. She looked at me the way someone looks at a thing they've been imagining for a very long time and are now recalibrating against reality. I did not hug her. I shook her hand. I sat down across from her and put my hands flat on the table, and I said, I want to understand the full picture before I make any decision, so I'd like you to tell me everything. She looked at Attorney Sharp. He nodded slightly, and she started talking. She had been 17 when she was pregnant with me. The father had left before I was born. She had placed me for adoption because she had nothing. No money, no support, no capacity to provide what a baby needed. She said she had thought about me every single year, every birthday. I noted this, but I didn't soften at it. I let her say it, and I held it at a small distance, and I kept listening. Then she got to the part I was waiting for. Her diagnosis. 18 months ago, her doctor had recommended bone marrow transplants as her best long-term option. She had a son. Here she paused. Bryce. She said his name quietly and carefully. She said Bryce had been tested 8 months ago. He wasn't a match? I asked. She looked at the table. He was a partial match. I sat with that. A partial match isn't nothing, I said. What did his medical team say? Another pause. Longer. Attorney Sharp shifted slightly in his chair. Bryce doesn't know, she said. I kept my face still. That he was tested? That you exist. There it was. The thing Marco had named in our kitchen 2 weeks ago, sitting in the open between all four of us now. Bryce had been told he was being tested for a general donor registry. He didn't know his mother had placed a daughter for adoption when she was 17. He didn't know I existed, and Renata had made the calculation, the specific, deliberate calculation, that coming to me was preferable to telling him the truth. I looked at her for a long moment. So you came to me, I said, because asking me keeps your secret. She flinched. It was small, but it was real. That's not the only reason, but it's a reason. She didn't answer. Which was an answer. I felt Marco's hand find mine under the table. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Renata. I need you to understand something, I said. And I kept my voice level because I'd learned a long time ago that level voices carry further than raised ones. I am not angry at you for placing me for adoption. I had an extraordinary life. Extraordinary parents. I mean that without irony, but I need you to understand that I am not a solution to a problem you created by keeping secrets from your son. I am a person, and whatever I decide to do here, it will be my decision. Based on what I believe is right, not based on what is convenient for you. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. I noted it, and kept going. I want to speak to your medical team directly before I agree to anything. I want a full picture of what compatibility testing involves, what a donation would require from my body, and what the realistic outcomes are, given that Bryce is already a partial match. And I want that information from doctors, not filtered through an attorney. She agreed. Immediately. Without hesitation, which told me she'd expected this. Maybe even hoped for it. We drove back to Phoenix that evening, mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Marco and I have always been good at that, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. About 40 minutes outside the city, he said, "You were extraordinary in there. I was just asking questions." "That's what I mean," he said. I watched the highway and thought about Bryce coaching youth soccer on weekends, with no idea that his mother had a daughter somewhere and had now found her and asked her for something enormous without first telling him the truth. I thought about what it would feel like to be him. To find out, eventually, because these things always come out eventually, that this had happened around him. I thought about what I was actually being asked to do. Not just medically. Structurally, I was being asked to participate in a secret, to potentially save a life, while helping to preserve a lie. And I wasn't sure I was willing to do that. I spent 2 weeks after that meeting, reading medical documents and thinking about Bryce. The doctors were straightforward with me, in a way Attorney Sharp never had been. Renata's condition was serious but not immediately terminal. She had time. Not unlimited time, but enough that the situation wasn't the emergency the lawyer's language had implied. Bryce's partial match gave him a real statistical possibility of being a viable donor with additional compatibility workup that hadn't been fully explored yet. My potential match was unknown because I hadn't been tested. I was a possibility, not a certainty. So here was what was actually true. Renata had a son who might be able to help her, who hadn't been fully evaluated, who didn't know the real reason he'd been swabbed 8 months ago. And she had found me, the daughter she gave away, the one who owed her nothing, the one who had no history with her, no relationship, no reason to protect her, and asked me to step in while her son remained in the dark. I made my decision on a Thursday morning. Marco was at work. I was sitting in the backyard of our little house. In the garden corner I'd been slowly redesigning, surrounded by the plants I'd put in last spring that were finally starting to take hold. There's something about working with living things that clarifies thinking for me. You can't rush them. You can't argue with them. They just do what they're built to do, given what they're given. I called Attorney Sharp. I told him I had made 2 decisions, and they were not separable. He could not take one without the other. The first decision. I was willing to undergo compatibility testing. The second decision. I would not do so under the current conditions. If I was a match and donation was recommended, Bryce would need to be told the truth before I agreed to move forward. Not by me. By Renata. I was not going to help save someone's life while helping them hide who they were from their own child. I would not be someone's convenient secret. I would be a person making a choice with full information, or I would not be involved at all. Attorney Sharp was quiet for a moment. I'll convey that to my client. Please do, I said. Renata called me herself 3 days later. No attorney on the line, just her voice, quieter than it had been in the conference room, and something in it that hadn't been there before. Something that sounded like it had been set down. She said she had told Bryce. She didn't describe the conversation in detail. She just said she had told him that it had been one of the hardest things she'd ever done, and that he was processing it. She said he wasn't ready to contact me, and she understood if that was the same for me. She said she was sorry, not for placing me for adoption, but for approaching me the way she had, for making me a solution before she'd made me a person. I sat with that for a moment. It was more than I'd expected from her. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I meant that. I got tested 2 weeks later. The results came back, and I was not a match, not even a partial one. The genetic lottery had not gone that direction. I called Renata to tell her. Her voice on the phone was tired but not broken. She said her medical team was going to do additional workup on Bryce's partial match and explore some newer treatment protocols that had become available. She said there were still options. I told her I genuinely hoped they worked. I meant that too. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say but that felt true when I said it. I told her that if she ever wanted to exchange letters, just letters, no pressure, no relationship required, just the occasional update, I would be open to that. I don't know exactly why I offered it. Maybe because she had done the hard thing with Bryce. Maybe because I have a nose that came from somewhere and somewhere had a face now. Maybe because my mom always said you don't have to become someone's family to acknowledge that they're a person. She said yes. Quietly and carefully, The way she said most things. I hung up and went out to the backyard. Marco was home by then, pulling weeds in the corner. I'd pointed him toward 3 weekends running and that he was finally actually addressing. He looked up when I came outside. "Well?" he said. "Not a match." He stood up and came to me and put both arms around me, and I let him. "How are you?" he said into my hair. I thought about it honestly for a moment. "I think I'm okay," I said. "I think I did the right thing." "You did," he said. "I called my parents that evening. Told my dad first because he picks up faster. He listened to the whole story the same way my mom had. Completely, quietly, and at the end he just said, 'Hazel, that's my girl.' And somehow that was exactly enough." I told Callum and Dean the next day. They reacted the way brothers do. Too many questions, slightly competitive theories about what they would have done differently, and then Dean said, "I mean, you're still our weird little sister regardless." And I laughed harder than I'd laughed in weeks. Here's what I want to say to anyone who's found this corner of the internet and stayed with me all the way to here. You do not owe anyone access to your life simply because of biology. You do not owe anyone a secret kept or a sacrifice made. What you owe yourself is the right to make your own decisions with full information, on your own terms, in your own time. I made mine, and I can live with them. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think or feel something you needed to feel, leave me a comment below. I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's more coming and you don't want to miss it. And like this video so more people can find their way here. Take care of yourselves. I mean that.